The year is 1200. The world, as civilization knew it, was a vast, sprawling map defined by impenetrable walls, thriving markets, and ancient power structures. Great sultans ruled in golden palaces, emperors commanded millions from forbidden cities, and the concept of global dominance seemed firmly settled within the established capitals of the known world. They were wrong. Terribly, catastrophically wrong. The greatest civilization destroyer in history was not coming from across the sea or from a rival empire, but from the desolate, frozen, wind-scoured emptiness that no one bothered to map properly, the Eurasian steppe. No one, not the haughty rulers of the mighty Jin dynasty, nor the sophisticated courts of the Khwarezmian Empire, nor the heavily armored, confident knights of Europe, spared a single thought for the scattered, ragged nomads hundreds of miles away. They believed their existence was too primitive, their divisions too deep to ever pose a threat. They ignored the whispers carried on the freezing gale, the sounds of 1,000,000 horses waiting in the great void. Can you believe that the man who would eventually command the deaths of 40 million people, who would oversee the destruction of entire civilizations, and who would carve out an empire that dwarfed Rome, began his life as nothing more than a freezing, abandoned, starving child, a castaway clinging to survival in a world that actively tried to swallow him whole? This is not just a history lesson. This is a horror story written in blood and fire, chronicling a catastrophe no one saw coming, a tidal wave of destruction that swept from the frozen tundra of Siberia all the way to the Adriatic Sea. We are talking about the Mongols, the horsemen of the apocalypse, the silent storm that descended upon civilization and left behind only ashes and the lingering fear of their impossible return. But to understand the fury of the wildfire, you must first witness the spark. We must journey back to the year 1162, a time of unrelenting chaos and tribal savagery, where the concept of Mongolia was merely a collection of warring, backstabbing clans obsessed with cattle wrestling and blood feuds. The steppe was less a nation and more a primal meat grinder. Life expectancy was counted in seasons, not decades. Loyalty was fleeting, and betrayal was the only reliable currency. If you couldn't kill your enemy, your family would starve. If you showed weakness, you died. His childhood was tragically short. When Temüjin was barely 9 years old, his father, Yesegai, made the fatal mistake of accepting food from a rival Tatar tribe. The food was poisoned. Yesegai died a slow, agonizing death, leaving behind a widow, 6 young children, and a rapidly dissolving legacy. This was the moment that forged the future world conqueror. Temüjin was forced to hunt marmots and mice just to survive the freezing nights. He learned the bitter taste of betrayal and the absolute necessity of vengeance. He understood that in the steppe, power was the only morality, and that only through unimaginable violence could true peace be achieved. The next few years were a living nightmare. Constant starvation, the threat of exposure, and the terror of being hunted by former friends. Temüjin was eventually captured by the Temüjin, a clan that had once been his allies, and they paraded him around in a wooden collar or kang. We are now standing at the very precipice of destruction, ready to witness the transformation of a betrayed nomad into the legendary Genghis Khan. But first, he must escape the torture of the wooden collar and survive the cold, desperate night that defines his destiny. This is the origin story of the man who redefined war itself. The Temüjin were celebrating their capture, drunk on fermented mare's milk, their attention momentarily focused on the roaring fire and the roasting meat. This was the razor's edge, the single flickering moment of opportunity provided by human complacency. Temüjin knew he would not get another chance. He waited until the guard, lulled by the warmth and the heavy drink, leaned against the post and drifted into a stupor. With a silent, agonizing twist, Temüjin brought the full force of his desperate body against the wooden yoke. He didn't break the collar, he slipped free, the slickness of his own sweat and the sheer exhaustion of the guard allowing the impossible gap. He ran, not towards the open steppe, but straight into the dense forest, the sound of his ragged breathing swallowed by the vast, indifferent night. The alarm was sounded almost instantly, the howls of the drunken Temüjin warriors echoing like hunting hounds baying for blood. They chased him for miles, a freezing, desperate race against the dawn. But Temüjin owed his life not to his own speed, but to the few, fiercely loyal souls who still remembered his father, Yasuge the Brave. A servant named Sorgen Shira, risking everything for a boy who had nothing, hid him beneath an overturned wagon load of wool. The search party passed so close Temüjin could smell the breath of their horses, their shouts chilling the air. When they finally rode away, the servant, the quiet hero of the hour, freed him. Temüjin was alone again, shivering, starving, but he was free. He understood then. Loyalty was not bought with gold or birthright, but with shared suffering and deep respect. Survival demanded structure, and structure meant alliances. His first move was a necessity, a strategic act of unification. He claimed his promised bride, Berta, from the respected Anguirot tribe. She was more than a wife. She was a political bridge, securing a crucial blood tie to a powerful neighboring clan. The Anguirot were a sophisticated people, renowned for the beauty of their women and their tradition of strong family loyalty, qualities Temüjin desperately needed to stabilize his own fragmented existence. The dowry he received, a magnificent sable coat, would soon play a role far beyond mere adornment. But the true cornerstone of his early military power was the relationship forged in the brutal school of the steppe, his sworn oath brother, or Anda, Jamuka. Jamuka was a warrior prince of the Jadaran tribe, charismatic, formidable, and dangerously ambitious. They had shared a boyhood bond, exchanging gifts, a whistle and an arrow, and now they swore the sacred oath of eternal brotherhood under the eternal blue sky. This bond transcended blood, promising mutual aid unto death. This was not a partnership of equals, but a merger of necessity. For a time, they rode together, two ambitious young wolves leading a pack of desperate outcasts, and their combined camp swelled to over 20,000 souls, a genuine military force capable of challenging the established order for the first time in Temüjin's life. The tenuous peace of their alliance was shattered by a nightmare that defined the ruthless reality of steppe life. The Merkits, a fearsome tribe who held an ancient, burning grudge against Temüjin's lineage, they had been the victims of Yasuge's earlier raids, struck with brutal efficiency and terrifying purpose. They descended upon Temüjin's camp in the pre-dawn darkness, a terrifying blur of dust and screaming horses. Temüjin himself escaped, riding frantically into the mountains, but he left behind the most precious thing he owned, the bond to his new family. Berta was captured, dragged from the yurt, and taken as a spoil of war, destined to be the wife of a Merkit chieftain. The humiliation was absolute, the violation unforgivable. This was the moment the survivor died, and the warlord was born. Temüjin did not just need to rescue his wife, he needed to completely annihilate the tribe that dared to touch her. Togrul Khan, also known by the Chinese title Wang Khan, commanded a colossal, organized force. Temüjin appealed to him, strategically offering the sable coat Berta had brought as her dowry, the ultimate symbol of respect and necessity, demanding the debt of old friendship be paid in blood. The resulting army was terrifying in its scope. 20,000 warriors, moving with an unprecedented synchronization across the frozen steppe. They struck the Merkid camp like a lightning storm, utilizing the cover of night and the element of surprise that would become the Mongols' signature tactic for generations. The Merkids were not just defeated, they were scattered to the winds, their power broken forever, their name nearly erased from the map of Asia. Berta was recovered, alive, though the scars of that captivity and the circumstances of her eventual return would haunt the early empire. The victory was intoxicating, but success often breeds division faster than failure. The relationship between Temüjin and Jamuka, always defined by a silent tension over leadership style, began to fray irrevocably. Jamuka respected traditional hierarchies. The superiority of the clan, the established lines of nobility dictated by birth. Temüjin, however, was fundamentally different, a self-made man who had suffered betrayal from his own kin. He promoted based on sheer merit, loyalty, and competence, not bloodline. He valued the ragged devotion of the outcasts and the slaves, the people who had nothing to lose but their lives, and everything to gain by following him. This radical meritocracy was revolutionary, a direct threat to Jamuka's aristocratic world order. The tension snapped during a seemingly minor dispute over where to graze their combined herds. Jamuka, seeing Temüjin's growing independent power, made his final dramatic separation. "Let us camp apart," he declared, his voice cold, "where we may be free of each other's shadows." This was not a tribal squabble. It was an ideological war for the future of the steppe. The clash came swiftly in 1187 at a place known only as Dalen Baojut, the 70 Marshes. This was Temüjin's first truly massive military engagement against a powerful, organized force led by his sworn brother. The battle was fierce, brutal, and ultimately a staggering defeat for Temüjin. Jamuka outmaneuvered him, crushing Temüjin's fledgling army and capturing many of his loyal followers. The humiliation was total. But Jamuka, in his moment of triumph, revealed the fatal flaw in his character: excessive, unforgettable cruelty. The air around Temüjin's growing encampment was no longer filled with the quiet desperation of the hunted, but with the clanging discipline of a machine being forged in the fires of hate. These were not just men. They were survivors who had seen their world burn to ash, and they looked upon Temüjin not as a chief, but as the inevitable instrument of divine bloody retribution. He understood that loyalty born of fear was brittle, but loyalty forged in shared trauma and the promise of ultimate payback was unbreakable. The first task was not just to raise an army, but to obliterate the very concept of tribal allegiance that had fractured the steppe for centuries, replacing it with something cold, hard, and terrifyingly modern. He needed order where there had only been chaos. He ripped apart the old tribal affiliations, the ancient bloodlines that caused perpetual feuding, and replaced them with a revolutionary, chillingly efficient military structure that would rewrite the rules of war for the next 200 years. This was the birth of the decimal system, the infrastructure of doom. Units of 10, 100, 1,000, the Menhan, and the earth-shattering 10,000-man Tumen, units bound together not by kin or clan loyalty, but by absolute, unquestioning military command. Suddenly, a man might serve alongside his lifelong enemy, a former Tatar serving shoulder to shoulder with a Karaid, yet both were united under the single, unyielding banner of Temüjin. This radical shift eliminated internal dissent, transforming the fractured steppe into a single, cohesive, deadly organism that moved as one mind. It was military genius disguised as simple administration, a system designed to ensure that if one unit broke, the entire chain would instantly collapse onto the offender, meaning every man had a vested interest in the absolute success and terror of his neighbor. The stakes were no longer honor, the stakes were survival. The first target for this terrifyingly new war machine, the Jurchen. They were a powerful sub-tribe who had betrayed Temüjin earlier, abandoning him in a moment of critical need. This was more than a skirmish. It was a public, bloody execution intended to send an earthquake across the entire vastness of the steppe. But the true test, the deep, boiling scar on his soul that demanded a final, apocalyptic cleansing, lay with the hated Tatar. These were the monsters who had poisoned his father, Yasuge, leaving Temüjin to scrape his existence from the dirt. This was not a conquest, it was a reckoning 20 years in the making. The ensuing campaign against the Tatar was relentless, a whirlwind of horse-borne terror and arrow storms that left the once proud Tatar completely broken, scattered, and driven to desperation. Temüjin was fueled by a private fury that transcended strategy, turning the war into a personal, chilling crusade. When the remnants of the Tatar were finally cornered, Temüjin faced a decision that would forever define his legendary cruelty and his chilling sense of strategic justice. He gathered the entire remaining Tatar population and issued a decree that sent shivers even through his hardened, battle-scarred generals. The order was simple, yet monstrous in its implications. Every male taller than the wheel axle of a cart, meaning roughly every boy capable of growing into a warrior, was to be executed instantly. The final battle for supremacy came at the treacherous, mountainous field of Khoitan, a clash that would decide the fate of the entire plateau and determine whether the future would be fractured or united under a single, terrifying will. Jamuka amassed a huge coalition of tribes, all terrified of Temüjin's rising terror, but critically, they lacked the single, unifying discipline that Temüjin had brutally enforced on his own men. The fight was a masterpiece of emerging Mongol tactics, the feigned retreat that lured the enemy into a fatal trap, the sudden surge of heavy cavalry that smashed the flanks, and the blinding arrow storm that descended like a biblical plague, paralyzing the enemy ranks before a single man could close the distance. Jamuka's coalition broke, not through lack of courage, but through lack of centralized, unforgiving command. Jamuka fled, hunted relentlessly by the very world he once commanded, a ghost of the glorious past pursued by the inevitable future. The final, sickening betrayal of Jamuka came from his own men, who, witnessing Temüjin's inevitable, crushing victory, shackled their former leader and delivered him to his rival, hoping to curry favor with the rising sun. With Jamukha gone, his body carried away and buried with solemn, grim honors, the ancient feuding steppe was finally terrifyingly silent. The endless chaos was over. The stage was set, and the world was about to hear the name of the man who had suffered, survived, and finally conquered every soul from the Great Wall to the Siberian forest. The endless chaos was indeed over, but what emerged from the ashes of the steppe was not merely a new chief, but the architect of global destruction. In 1206, beside the waters of the Kherlen River, the greatest gathering of Mongol nobles, the Kurultai, shook the very ground beneath them as they formally proclaimed Temüjin their supreme ruler, their universal Khan, Genghis Khan. This was not a mere political title. It was a divine mandate, a declaration of war against the very concept of borders, the ultimate realization of the Mongols' destiny under the eternal blue sky. He had taken the broken pieces of a forgotten people, forged them in the fires of survival, and now held the reins of history's most terrifying war machine, perfectly honed and ready for unleashing upon an unsuspecting world of silk and stone. The moment this title was uttered, the foundations of every major civilization shuddered, though they didn't know it yet. The first command of the newly crowned Khan was simple. Discipline, total and absolute, would replace the ancient, unreliable chaos of blood ties. He instituted the Temüjin, the massive division of 10,000 warriors, subdivided rigorously into regiments of thousands, companies of hundreds, and squads of 10, a decimal system so meticulous and effective it made previous armies look like disorganized mobs clinging desperately to obsolete traditions. Promotions were based solely on battlefield performance, skill with the bow, and unyielding loyalty to the Khan himself, a radical meritocratic concept that instantly crushed the lingering power of the old, squabbling nobility and ensured that every soldier, from the poorest shepherd to the highest general, fought with terrifying personal ambition and unified purpose. The traditional tribal camps were replaced by a central, mobile capital known as the Ordo, a command center that moved with the speed of the wind, symbolizing the relentless, unstoppable momentum of the new empire. Then came the law, the legendary Yasa, a secret and sacred code of conduct that enforced obedience with the chilling swiftness of lightning and defined the very fabric of Mongol society and warcraft. It mandated religious tolerance because the gods of the conquered mattered little as long as their men feared the Khan, but demanded absolute, unflinching fealty to the supreme leader. The Yasa decreed that desertion was punishable not just by the death of the traitor, but by the instantaneous execution of the entire squad from which he fled, ensuring peer pressure became a fatal, highly effective form of battlefield discipline. It stipulated that any soldier caught looting before the final decisive victory was committing capital treason, forcing the men to prioritize strategic goals over immediate gain, a radical change from traditional nomadic raiding. This wasn't just law. It was the operating manual for a conquering civilization, designed meticulously to replace the chaos of the nomadic past with a terrifying, unified purpose, ready to be exported by force across the entire continent. With the terrifying efficiency of this new machine fully operational, Genghis looked beyond the steppe. He saw the wealthy, settled empires that had long mocked, taxed, and exploited the Mongols, treating them like a pestilence rather than a threat. His eyes settled first on the Tangut kingdom of Shisia, nestled in the fertile lands south of the Gobi Desert, a rich prize, but also a crucial strategic point needed to secure the western flank, and more importantly, a crucial testing ground for the new military machine against stone walls. The Xia had insulted the Mongols for generations, refusing to submit tribute when commanded and treating them as simple, easily dismissed barbarians. Now, they would serve a far more vital purpose. They would be the whetstone upon which the unstoppable Mongol cavalry would be sharpened, the sacrificial lamb whose fall would send shockwaves across the entire Silk Road. The initial campaign, launched around 1209, was a whirlwind of motion and dust. The speed of the Mongol advance was shocking. They didn't march toward the borders, they flowed across the landscape like a destructive, premeditated flood. Their primary tactic remained the calculated, feigned retreat, luring heavily armored Xia armies out of their fortified positions and into impossible ambushes, where they were utterly devastated by a coordinated, massive rain of composite arrows that could punch through thick armor. But Xia had fortified cities, towering stone walls that cavalry alone, no matter how skilled, could never breach. This was the pivotal moment Genghis Khan, the pragmatic genius, recognized the immediate limits of his nomadic prowess and initiated the second great evolution of his war machine. He didn't just order the smashing of the walls, he ruthlessly absorbed the knowledge of those who built them. Captured engineers, skilled artisans, and specialized siege experts from the conquered territories were immediately pressed into service under the penalty of excruciating death, forced to construct the very catapults, massive trebuchets, and colossal siege towers that would destroy their own people. The irony was chilling and absolute. The most successful conquerors in history were not simply innovators. They were the ultimate, ruthless integrators, borrowing and perfecting the advanced technology of the very civilizations they were destined to erase from the map. With Xia humbled, its capital besieged and forced into humiliating vassalage, now a critical source of tribute, manpower, and military aid, Genghis Khan now turned his full, searing gaze toward the true monster looming over the horizon. The Jin dynasty, the mighty Jurchen rulers of North China. This was no small kingdom. This was a colossal empire, fortified by millions of people, endless treasuries, vast agricultural wealth, and the imposing multi-layered defensive line known to history as the Great Wall. The Jin court in Zhengdu, the magnificent capital known today as Beijing, viewed the Mongols with utter, fatal, and blinding disdain, haughtily calling them mere fleas on the plains, and believing their ancient, thick stone walls were invincible barriers against any possible barbarian threat. They had committed the ultimate sin of underestimating the man who had survived hell, and they had absolutely no idea they were about to face the literal, riding, galloping apocalypse. In 1211, the full-scale invasion of the Jin began, a movement so vast and encompassing it seemed to blot out the sun and shake the earth's crust. The Mongols, now seamlessly aided by auxiliary Xia troops and their newly acquired specialized siege engineers, crashed against the massive, age-old defenses of the Great Wall. This time, the walls didn't hold. Through a combination of daring maneuvers, exploiting structural weak points, and sheer, overwhelming, disciplined force, the Mongol Temüjins poured through the passes, breaching the defenses that had been designed to last 1,000 years. But the true weapon, the invisible vanguard, was the psychological terror. Genghis Khan understood instinctively that fear traveled faster than any horse or messenger. His armies deliberately and brutally exterminated entire populations that resisted, sending the few horrified survivors fleeing in every direction to spread the chilling, paralyzing message. Resistance meant absolute annihilation. Submission meant possible, temporary survival. The ultimate objective was Zhongdu, the glittering capital, a city of incredible wealth and size, defended by multiple layers of massive stone walls that dwarfed anything the Mongols had ever seen. The siege was long, brutal, and utterly transformative for the Mongols, forcing them to fight like sophisticated sedentary powers for the first time in their history. They deployed every captured engineer, every massive trebuchet, and employed starvation and encirclement tactics, patiently waiting as the proud, arrogant Jin dynasty slowly strangled on its own hubris, trapped inside walls that had quickly become their magnificent tomb. The Jin emperor, finally breaking under the unrelenting pressure and realizing the utter futility of resisting the patient, tireless Mongol grip, committed the ultimate act of cowardice. He fled south in a desperate, panicked retreat to the city of Kaifeng, abandoning his ancestral city, his people, and his own destiny to the wolves. This flight was the final fatal crack in the dynasty's armor, a sign not just of military defeat, but of complete moral disintegration, signaling to every soldier, every official, and every starving child left behind that their sovereign had signed their death warrant. It was the year 1215. The gates of Zhongdu finally shuddered open, not smashed by siege engines, but opened from within by desperate, traitorous remnants of the garrison, men who sought mercy they would not receive. What followed was not a clean military occupation, but a furious, prolonged explosion of violence, rape, and systematic looting that lasted for an entire month, staining the very foundations of the future Beijing red with the blood of its citizens. The Mongols, driven by the bitterness of centuries of perceived Han and Jurchen arrogance, showed no mercy, tearing down temples, palaces, and markets, taking everything of value that had been amassed over half a millennium of advanced civilization. Gold, silk, bronze, jade, astronomical instruments, and countless libraries. The spoils were so vast, so overwhelming in their magnitude, that even Genghis Khan, miles away planning his next moves, realized he needed an entirely new system just to manage the sheer volume of treasure flooding back into the steppes. This was the pivotal moment the Mongols stopped being purely nomadic raiders and were forced, by the sheer, crushing weight of their own success, to invent rudimentary administrative infrastructure to process the spoils of a conquered world, leveraging captured Chinese scholars and engineers to manage the bureaucracy of plunder. With northern China subdued and burning, its riches flowing like a massive, glittering river back to the grasslands, Genghis Khan could have paused. He could have settled into the unimaginable luxury of the stolen thrones, content with ruling the largest contiguous land empire the world had ever seen up to that point, a domain stretching from the Siberian forests to the Great Wall. But true conquest was not a destination. It was the only way to remain relevant, the only way to satisfy the insatiable hunger of his burgeoning hordes, now swollen by defecting soldiers and coerced Chinese craftsmen. He delegated the complicated, messy business of managing sedentary subjects to his most trusted general, Mukhali, the king, a title unheard of in the traditional egalitarian Mongol hierarchy, granting him total plenary powers to finish off the remaining Jin resistance and manage the delicate, complex dance of administration. Genghis Khan, however, was already turning his gaze sharply westward, toward the setting sun, toward lands that were rich beyond imagining, immensely powerful, and, critically, utterly unaware of the apocalyptic storm gathering on their horizon. Far, far to the west, stretching across the vast expanse of Persia, Afghanistan, and the whole of Central Asia, lay the mighty Khwarezmian Empire. This was no fragmented collection of tribal chiefs. This was a sophisticated, colossal Islamic powerhouse ruled by Shah Muhammad II, a man whose arrogance was matched only by the size of his army. A force estimated by some at over 400,000 professional soldiers, far better equipped and trained than the Jurchen forces the Mongols had just dismantled. The Shah considered himself the second Alexander, the master of the world's most critical trade routes, the absolute controller of the legendary Silk Road. He viewed the Mongols, those dirty, distant barbarians from the eastern plains, with utter, contemptuous disdain, seeing them as little more than a passing nuisance, a band of opportunistic brigands who had gotten lucky against the ridiculously weak Jin. He believed the vast, arid distances were his ultimate, impenetrable shield, a physical barrier that no army, especially not one relying solely on horseback and mutton, could possibly cross in fighting condition to pose a serious threat. This monumental hubris, this spectacular failure of strategic imagination, would prove to be the most expensive, most catastrophic mistake in the entire history of the medieval world. Initially, Genghis Khan sought a practical, strategic alliance, not an immediate bloody war. He saw the Khwarezmian Empire as a crucial partner for trade, sending a massive, incredibly rich caravan, hundreds of camels laden with the most exquisite silk, gold bullion, and precious furs, accompanied by official diplomatic envoys seeking to open officially sanctioned trade routes. This was a crucial test of the New World Order. Would the powerful Muslim world recognize the legitimacy of the upstart Mongol Khan? When the horrific news reached Genghis Khan, the legendary calm that often masked his furious inner resolve absolutely shattered into shards of pure rage. An ambassador, under the sacred laws of the steppes and the universal rules of warfare, was inviolable. To murder them was not just an act of war, it was an act of profound spiritual insult, a violation of the sky-mandated order of the world. The Khan was reported to have climbed a sacred mountain, removing his helmet and belt and praying for 3 days and 3 nights to the eternal blue sky, demanding absolute justice and vengeance for the slaughter of his people. When he descended, the decision was made. This was no longer about territory or simple plunder. This was about retribution, absolute, divine, and total. The Khwarezmian Empire had signed its own death warrant, not with a treaty of surrender, but with a blade against the neck of a Mongol envoy. Genghis Khan gathered his generals, his commanders now masters of both advanced siegecraft and open battle, and announced the campaign that would change the map of the world forever and permanently redefine the meaning of terror. The Great Western Journey had begun. The steppe had tasted the blood of the East, and now it turned its hungry, vengeful eyes toward the soft, unsuspecting heart of Islam, ready to unleash a terror the civilized world had not yet dared to imagine. They thought they were safe. They believed the civilized moat of the Oxus River, the vast deserts, and the sheer cultural superiority of the Khwarezmian Shah Muhammad II would be enough to halt the galloping storm from the steppes. They were fatally wrong. What the Shah failed to understand was that Genghis Khan did not just conquer, he reacted. And his reaction, when provoked, was always biblical in its scale and absolutely unforgiving in its scope. A vengeance so terrible it would rewrite the definition of war. The Khan had initially sent emissaries, an olive branch wrapped in silk and trade agreements, seeking passage and partnership for his growing commercial network along the ancient Silk Road. He offered peace, hoping to avoid bloodshed and focus his immense fury elsewhere. But Shah Muhammad, ruling over an empire that stretched from the Caspian Sea to the Persian Gulf, a man blinded by staggering, debilitating arrogance, saw only weakness in the Khan's calculated offer. He saw an opportunity to demonstrate the monumental power of his sophisticated, organized civilization against these shaggy, illiterate barbarians. The governor of the crucial border city of Otrar, a man named Inalchuk, took the disastrous bait, driven by simple greed and a lethal misjudgment of the situation brewing on the horizon. He seized the Mongol caravan, a priceless collection of gold, jade, and furs, falsely claiming they were spies infiltrating his sovereign territory. He killed the chief Mongol ambassador, humiliating the others by shaving their beards, the ultimate insult to a warrior's dignity, and sent them back to the steppes with their terrifying message. The dice were thrown into the abyss. The final, unforgivable line had been crossed, sealing the fate of millions. The Khan received the broken men and the staggering news of the massacre. The entire world of the steppes seemed to hold its breath. He climbed the highest hill in his homeland, tearing his royal robes in a ceremonial act of profound mourning, and invoking the aid of the eternal blue sky, screaming for the celestial blessing on the utter, comprehensive vengeance he was about to unleash. The mobilization that followed was unprecedented, even for Genghis Khan. Nearly 200,000 disciplined, battle-hardened soldiers, the full, devastating might of the Mongol war machine, were pointed directly at the fertile, unsuspecting heart of Central Asia. The Khwarezmian Empire had the immense numbers, potentially triple the Mongol force, but they made the fatal, paralyzing mistake of scattering their forces into garrisons to defend every single major city simultaneously. They waited for the storm to hit the border at Otrar, expecting a grueling, traditional siege that would bleed the Mongols dry. Genghis Khan, however, was not interested in predictable, slow-moving warfare. His strategy was built entirely upon terror, division, speed, and the element of impossible surprise, a terrifying three-pronged assault that appeared to defy the very geography and logistics of the region. While a large force held Otrar in an agonizing, slow siege, drawing the Shah's primary attention, Genghis Khan himself, alongside his brilliant tactical commanders, vanished into the vast, waterless Kizilkum Desert, a route considered utterly impassable by any organized army. It was a logistical miracle achieved through sheer, unbending will, a ghostly column of horsemen marching across the scorching sands, appearing out of nowhere like a demon army conjured by dark magic, striking the unsuspecting jewel of the East, the magnificent city of Bukhara. The citizens of Bukhara, the storied center of Islamic learning and scholarship, watched in bewildered, paralyzed horror as the horde materialized literally on their doorsteps. The garrison panicked, realizing they had been utterly outmaneuvered and cut off from the capital. After a swift, brutal assault, the main defenders fled in absolute disarray, leaving the entire populace exposed to the unimaginable, apocalyptic terror they had only heard whispered of. Genghis Khan rode into the city center, a figure of myth made suddenly real, and rode his warhorse straight into the grand sacred courtyard of the massive Kalan Mosque. He forced his horse to drink from the marble fountain where the faithful once performed ritual ablutions, an act of intentional, profound desecration. Then he ascended the pulpit, not to pray or offer clemency, but to deliver a chilling, unforgettable sermon of pure retribution to the weeping, terrified populace. "You have committed great sins," he supposedly roared, his voice echoing through the silent, burning arches, "and those among your chiefs who are guilty of these sins are the greatest criminals." He made his true purpose chillingly clear. He was not a conqueror seeking mere land or tribute. He was the physical, temporal wrath of God, sent to punish them for their unforgivable transgressions and their terrible arrogance. The subsequent looting, enslavement, and burning were systematic, brutally efficient, and terrifyingly total. Bukhara was absolutely reduced to ash, tears, and a horrifying silence. Next came Samarkand, the capital, the pulsing, beating heart of the Khwarezmian world, initially defended by a massive garrison of 110,000 men and 20 war elephants, creatures of terrifying ancient warfare. But the psychological terror that had preceded the Mongols had already broken the defenders' collective will. Meanwhile, Shah Muhammad II, the once mighty sultan, crumbled entirely under the immense psychological and military pressure. Instead of rallying his armies and mounting a defense, he fled west in utter panic, abandoning his people, his capital, and his dignity entirely. He became a terrified, hunted ghost, desperately seeking refuge while the unstoppable Mongol generals, the legendary Jebe and Subutai, were tasked with the humiliating duty of hunting him down like vermin. This was not a mere pursuit. It was a devastating, relentless demonstration of psychological warfare across thousands of miles. 2 full detachments of the finest Mongol light cavalry relentlessly pursued the Shah across Persia, never letting him rest, running him ragged across mountains, across deserts, and across endless plains. They were the hounds of hell, snapping at his heels, ensuring he had no moment of peace. The Shah's ignominious flight took him thousands of miles, culminating in a miserable, desperate hiding place on a small, squalid island in the Caspian Sea, far from the mainland and all civilization. There, surrounded only by fear and the remnants of his shattered court, the once proud ruler died of pleurisy, a broken man who had watched his glorious empire dissolve into a nightmare of fire and dust. But the true horror was only just beginning its agonizing crawl west. The pursuit of the Shah had taken Jebe and Subutai far beyond Khwarezmia's formal borders. With the main objective accomplished, Genghis Khan gave them a new, chilling, impossible order: do not return the way you came back to Mongolia. Instead, they were to continue their reconnaissance raid, pushing aggressively north and west, a journey of pure, unbridled exploration, scouting, and conquest that would take the thunder of the Mongol hooves into lands that had never even heard the name of Genghis Khan, shattering the ancient, complacent peace of the Caucasus and the vast Russian steppes. The entire civilized West was utterly unprepared for the unstoppable, bloody tide that was now rolling toward its unsuspecting shores. The earth did not merely tremble, it shuddered in existential dread. Subutai Bahadur, the general of generals, and the tireless Jebe, the arrow, having successfully completed the annihilation of Khwarezmia and chased the Shah's heir across Persia, now burst through the iron gates of Derbent, pouring out of the Caucasus Mountains like a geological catastrophe unleashed upon the unsuspecting West. They were not looking for the petty wealth of the highlands. They were executing a mission of reconnaissance and terror, stumbling upon the vast, soft, and utterly defenseless heart of Eastern Europe, which lay before them fragmented and ripe for the taking. The Kingdom of Georgia, a proud, rich state renowned for its pious armies and formidable mountain fortresses, became the first major organized Christian state to feel the true, shocking weight of the Mongol advance. They believed their faith and their steel were impenetrable shields against these nomadic devils. But at the Battle of Kunan, the Mongol scouting parties, not even the core of the main army, executed a feigned retreat so flawlessly that the Georgian cavalry charged straight into their own doom. The seasoned knights were swallowed whole by perfectly timed flanking maneuvers and a blizzard of composite arrows that seemed to materialize from thin air, leaving the mighty Georgian army nothing but a memory etched in gore upon the freezing earth. The Cuman Kipchak Khan, desperately fleeing the relentless, years-long Mongol pursuit that had already destroyed his people, finally threw himself upon the mercy of the Rus princes, the proud, often squabbling rulers of Kiev, Galicia, and Chernigov. For once, perhaps for the last time in their history, the bickering Slavic princes actually listened to the desperate pleas of their former enemies, recognizing in the Cumans' terror a shared and overwhelming doom that respected neither border nor crown. Recognizing the gravity of the threat, they assembled a massive, lumbering coalition, an army drawn from the finest knights and the most seasoned druzhina across the principalities. This colossal force, estimates place it near 80,000 strong, was intended to be the ultimate shield of Eastern Christianity, and it marched confidently to meet the mysterious invaders, certain that sheer numbers, heavy armor, and traditional European military discipline would crush the light, fleeting cavalry of the steppes. Subutai, however, was not interested in a chivalrous or honorable clash of shields. He was a master of strategic annihilation and tactical deception. He did not engage them head-on. Instead, he led the Rus coalition on a deadly, agonizing chase that lasted for 9 brutal days. 9 days of relentless pursuit, dragging the heavily armored Rus army across the burning summer steppes, exhausting their mounts, fracturing their unity, and stretching their supply lines past the absolute breaking point in a masterclass of psychological warfare. The Mongol armies continuously retreated, never fully engaging, forcing the Rus generals to believe they were chasing a demoralized, fleeing enemy, thereby driving them into an ever-increasing state of arrogant disorganization. When the princes finally cornered the supposedly defeated Mongols at the Kalka River in May 1223, they believed victory was already theirs. They had tasted the blood of the stragglers and felt the flush of false triumph. But the moment the Mongols turned their well-rested, disciplined ranks, the trap snapped shut with the terrifying finality of a perfectly engineered mechanism. The Great Coalition shattered almost instantly into disorganized chaos. The armies of the princes, unable to coordinate their efforts, rushed forward piecemeal, engaging in isolated battles rather than unified fronts, only to be met by a terrifying, ceaseless hail of composite arrows that cut through armor and morale alike. The Mongols were everywhere and nowhere, utilizing the terrain to surround, envelop, and eliminate cohesive units before disappearing back into the dust clouds, reappearing moments later to deliver another deadly volley. Mstislav the Bold of Galicia watched in absolute horror as the forces of Kiev, who had foolishly stood back and built a defensive palisade instead of joining the initial fight, were slowly encircled and strategically starved of water until their position became utterly untenable. The greatest gathering of Slavic military might the world had ever seen, dissolved not into a battle, but into a desperate, panicked stampede of terrified men, hunted down mercilessly by the Mongol horse archers who showed no fatigue and offered even less mercy. The losses were staggering, reaching nearly 70% of the total Rus forces. The princes themselves, including the mighty Mstislav of Kiev, were captured alive, their regal dignity stripped away and replaced with the terror of imminent, agonizing death. But the Mongols did not execute them in the traditional manner. They considered the spilling of noble blood taboo, a spiritual contamination of the earth. Instead, they enacted a far more gruesome, humiliating, and utterly terrifying form of execution that spoke volumes about their view of established, pampered royalty. They turned back, disappearing back into the vast, empty east, leaving behind a silence more profound and terrifying than any scream. They had mapped every route, tested the exact strength of the Westerners' defense, and delivered a message that no one in Kiev or Budapest dared to fully comprehend. This was not a raid. It was a highly successful, devastating reconnaissance mission. The great unified Khanate had merely tested the lock on Europe's front door. The door was flimsy, the lock was broken, and Europe had been warned. But in its arrogance and disunity, the West merely interpreted the Kalka River massacre as a strange, isolated tragedy caused by unknown bandits. They did not understand that the true apocalyptic storm, the massive, unified Mongol invasion under the command of Batu Khan, was already gathering its strength, preparing to engulf the entire continent 4 short, fatal years later. 4 short, fatal years. That was the time the fragmented, feuding principalities of the Rus lands were given between the devastating reconnaissance raids and the arrival of the true apocalyptic storm. They spent those years doing what every doomed civilization seems to do, ignoring the existential threat, preoccupied instead with petty internal squabbles over minor territories and titles. They thought the warnings were myth, tales of terror told by terrified men whose minds had been broken by hardship. They were about to learn that those refugees hadn't exaggerated the horror. They had drastically understated the destructive capability of the great Khan's unified host. The hammer fell in late 1237, just as the bitter cold was setting in, traditionally the season when all serious warfare ground to a halt. But for the Mongols, winter was not a deterrent. It was the ultimate logistical advantage, turning the massive, meandering rivers and muddy swamps of the north into frozen, wide-open highways. This invasion was led by Batu Khan, the grandson of the conqueror, but its true, terrifying intelligence came from the mind of Subutai Bahadur, the general of generals, the one man who had never lost a campaign and whose strategic genius dwarfed every military commander in Europe combined. He was ready to execute the grandest, most ambitious plan in Mongol history, the systematic annihilation of the Western world. Their first target was Ryazan. The Prince of Ryazan, Yuri Igorovich, understood the impossibility of the defense and sent his son Fedor to the Mongol camp as a desperate attempt at peace and diplomacy. The result was predictable and horrific. Fedor was executed, and the Mongol demand was absolute submission and 10% of everything the city possessed. Yuri refused, knowing that if he paid, the demands would simply escalate until they took everything, including the very lives of his people. The Mongol response was terrifyingly swift. They did not bother with the slow, starving sieges of European warfare. They utilized engineers stolen from the great, conquered cities of China and Persia. These experts erected massive siege engines, capable of hurling boulders the size of small carts, hammering the walls day and night without rest. Within 5 days, Ryazan was breached. The destruction that followed was not just military, it was an act of complete psychological warfare designed to paralyze the subsequent kingdoms with fear. Every person found alive was slain, the city walls were pulled down, and the entire principality was rendered utterly uninhabitable. The Mongols did not just conquer territory, they vaporized the existing infrastructure and memory of the defeated foe. The message was sent in fire and blood. Resistance guarantees total erasure. Next came Kolomna. Here, the Grand Prince Yuri II of Vladimir finally sent a contingent, led by his son Vsevolod, to intercept the Mongol advance. It was a desperate, bloody, pitched battle fought on the frozen riverbanks, where the Rus forces fought with immense bravery, but bravery alone was useless against Subutais' coordination. The Mongol arrows darkened the sky, and the Rus troops found themselves encircled, cut off from all retreat, and systematically destroyed. Prince Vsevolod was killed, and the path to the wealthiest prize in the region, Vladimir, was now clear. The speed of this campaign was unprecedented. The entire northern flank had crumbled in the span of weeks. The siege of Vladimir was the psychological heart attack for the Rus people. Grand Prince Yuri II fled, desperately attempting to gather the reinforcements that would never materialize, leaving his family and the heart of his kingdom exposed to the storm. The Mongols arrived, surrounding the mighty Golden Gate, the symbol of Rus's resilience, and they tore down the timber walls with focused, merciless efficiency, using fire and stone to render the defenses meaningless. When the city fell in February 1238, the horrors reached a new, sickening peak. Thousands who sought sanctuary in the great cathedral of the Dormition, hoping that God or the thick stone walls would save them, were sealed inside by the Mongols, who then systematically set the structure ablaze, burning everyone within alive. The entire region was reduced to ash and blood in a few horrifying months. Batu Khan had achieved what centuries of Viking raids and internal strife could not. He had unified the disunited principalities through shared, overwhelming terror. For nearly 2 years, the Mongols paused their main westward thrust, focusing instead on consolidating the vast new territories, which would become the core of the Golden Horde, and hunting down the remaining pockets of resistance in the deep forests. But the true prize, the historical and cultural heart of the lands, still stood defiant, though paralyzed with fear. Kiev, the mother of Rus cities. Subutai knew that while Vladimir was militarily important, Kiev was symbolically crucial. Its fall would signal to the entire European continent that the impossible was now inevitable. In 1240, the Mongol legions finally descended upon Kiev. The legendary fortifications that had stood for centuries were nothing against the sophisticated siege engines perfected in the workshops of Cathay and Persia. The walls cracked, the towers crumbled, and the city that had once represented the pinnacle of Eastern Slavic civilization was utterly extinguished. The reports sent back to the terrified kingdoms of Poland and Hungary were not just warnings, they were blueprints of annihilation. The Pope, the emperors, the kings of Western Europe, they had dismissed the Mongols as disorganized barbarians fighting among themselves in the wasteland. They were facing the most logistically advanced, unified military machine the world had ever conceived. Subutai was already looking past the smoldering ruins of Kiev. His plan was audacious, bordering on insane. a massive, coordinated pincer movement that would strike Central Europe simultaneously, shattering the great powers before they could combine their armies into a cohesive defense. He needed to eliminate two main obstacles blocking the way to the rich fields and cities of the West: Poland, which protected the vital northern flank and the routes to the Holy Roman Empire, and Hungary, the massive, wealthy kingdom that offered refuge to their primary tribal enemies, the nomadic Cuman Kipchaks. The stage was set for 1241, the invasion of Europe proper, the moment history remembers as the greatest near-apocalypse of the medieval age. The Golden Horde was not stopping at the forests. It was coming for the cathedrals, and the entire continent was wholly unprepared for the sheer scale of the horror coming for them. The medieval world had just witnessed the destruction of the Kievan Rus, but Western Europe, in its arrogant complacency, still saw the Mongol advance as merely a chaotic skirmish among Eastern heathens. They believed the dense German forests, the heavily fortified stone castles, and the sheer weight of their armored chivalry would halt the steppe demons, confident in the superiority of their steel and their faith against this foreign, pagan terror. They failed to grasp that the Mongols, directed by the genius of Subutai, had already meticulously mapped the continent using spies and captured merchants, knowing the rivers, the passes, and the political weaknesses better than the local kings themselves. This was not an invasion. It was a strategically perfected, surgical annihilation, planned years in advance, with 1241 AD set as the year the world would truly change forever. Subutai, the unmatched strategist who had never lost a major engagement, decided not to attack the entire continent head-on, but to paralyze the defense through division. Two main thrusts were launched: a smaller but lethal force aiming for Poland and German territories to neutralize northern assistance, and the main, overwhelming force targeting Hungary, the great gateway to Central Europe and the plains that the Mongol cavalry craved. The northern wing, led by Baidar and Kaidu, ripped through Polish lands with terrifying speed, ignoring fortified cities and aiming only to draw out and destroy the field armies. Duke Henry the Pious of Silesia, along with Polish knights, Moravian troops, and a significant contingent of Teutonic knights, gathered the full might of northern Europe to meet the threat. They met the Mongols near Ligniga, Liegnitz, in April, a battle set to determine the fate of the Slavic and Germanic kingdoms. Europe's heavy, slow-moving cavalry faced the light, ceaseless fury of the steppe, and the result was pre-written in blood by the Mongols' mastery of deception. The Mongols employed their signature tactic, the feigned retreat, a psychological weapon perfected over decades of conquest. As the massive European heavy cavalry charged, confident of breaking the seemingly fleeing light horsemen, the Mongols suddenly wheeled, and hidden flanking forces emerged, raining deadly arrows into the compressed and exhausted European ranks. The sight of their own banners being abandoned by their retreating forces drew the Europeans deeper and deeper into the killing trap, breaking their cohesion and exposing them to the lethal Mongol volleys from all sides. The coordination of the Mongol forces was otherworldly, the signaling flawless, turning the charge of the finest knights in Christendom into a disorganized, panicked slaughter. King Bela, learning of the horror in the east, gathered perhaps 60,000 men, a truly massive army for the time, fortified by heavy knights, crossbowmen, and various allied contingents. The Mongols cornered Bela's army near the Sajo River, Battle of Mohi, where Bela, cautious after the disaster at Lignica, fortified his camp, relying on the wide river crossing to protect him from a frontal assault. Subutai, however, viewed the river not as a barrier, but as an opportunity for strategic complexity. Under the darkness of night, the Mongols used siege engines brought all the way from Asia, catapults and trebuchets, to clear the Hungarian defenses at the bridgehead, a technological and strategic shock to the Europeans who thought only they possessed advanced siege craft. While Batu engaged the front, Subutai, leading a massive flanking force, quietly crossed the river upstream under cover of dawn, utilizing a complex series of pontoon bridges and stealthy movements that defied the very nature of such a large cavalry force. When the Hungarians realized they were completely enveloped and trapped against the river, panic set in immediately. In a final, chilling display of tactical genius, the Mongols deliberately left a gap in their encirclement, a funnel of death, allowing the heavy Hungarian forces to try and flee, turning their orderly retreat into a terrifying rout of disorganized men trapped in thick mud and dense brush. The rout allowed the Mongols to pursue and slaughter the fleeing knights and infantry for days, maximizing the destruction of the opposing army's manpower and leadership. King Bela barely escaped, fleeing across the Adriatic Sea, utterly broken. Hungary was then subjected to a year of unparalleled systematic terror. Villages were razed, cities destroyed, and the population decimated by starvation and slaughter as the Mongols settled in for the long haul. They probed deep into Austria and Croatia, their scouting parties reaching the very gates of Vienna and the Adriatic coast, their presence a shadow of death hanging over the entire continent. The Holy Roman Empire was mobilizing, but they were too slow, too divided, and utterly paralyzed by the speed and ferocity of the invasion. Europe stood on the knife's edge of total annihilation, facing an enemy that had just obliterated two major kingdoms in a single season, and the path to the wealthy Italian city-states, the heart of the Pope's domain, lay open and undefended. The final, annihilating thrust into Western Europe was imminent, the vanguard already preparing to cross the Alps and bring the wrath of the steppe to Rome itself. Then, just as the fate of Europe was sealed, a message arrived from the far side of the world, from the capital of Karakorum itself, halting the greatest invasion the world had ever seen. It was not a message of reinforcement, but a decree of recall. On December 11, 1241, the great Khan Ogedei, the son of Genghis, had died. According to the sacred law of the Mongols, all major Chinggisid princes, including Batu Khan and the generals leading the charge into Austria, had to return immediately to the steppe for the Kurultai, the great assembly to elect the next great Khan. Europe was saved, not by its own strength, its stone castles, or its chivalry, but by a simple, sudden heart attack thousands of miles away. The continent had been given a sudden, miraculous, and entirely undeserved reprieve from the apocalypse.